the Yoon government officially mentioned that the government will come up with a new Indo-Pacific strategy, and I think the government is preparing now. What's the expectation, from Washington towards South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy? I mean, certainly it's a welcoming effort, but do you have any thoughts? What would you suggest, for example?
So I think that South Korea's desire to author their own Indo-Pacific strategy is, I think it's partly a reflection of the shadow cast by China, in the sense that other countries, Japan, Australia, and others, have simply sought to support the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. But South Korea's choice has been to develop their own Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, how different that will look from the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, I don't think it's going to look that different, frankly. I mean, I think there may be tweaks here and there, but I think overall the same core concepts of resilient supply chains, open political orders, open trade, clean networks when it comes to 5G. I think all transparent development assistance, freedom of navigation. I think all of these things will be part of the South Korean Indo-Pacific strategy as it is a part of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. And so there may be some small tweaks or differences, but I think the real challenge on the South Korean side for the authors of this new Indo-Pacific strategy is how to write something that looks different from the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, because I think they agree on almost everything in the strategy. And so why do the Koreans need to author a separate one? I think that in part has to do with China and trying not to have China perceive South Korea as being 100% in lockstep with the United States, Japan, and Australia, because of fear of economic coercion from China.
Right. Well, the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, contains economic, diplomatic, but also very strong, military security dimensions of policies. Whereas Japan, maybe Australia, some of the Southeast Asian countries, they put more focuses on economic side. So there is some difference in terms of weight over the security. So South Korean, when South Korea writes the Indo-Pacific strategy, most delicate part should be, how to write about the security aspects of Indo-Pacific.
I think that's true, but at the same time, I think that, South Korea is dealing with incursions by Russia and China into their airspace, into their territorial waters. This is the problems that Japan, the Philippines, and others are facing on these issues are also being faced by South Korea. So I think that while they will try to finesse this part of the strategy, at the core, I think they understand that the issues that they need to deal with in the Indo-Pacific are very similar as the other countries. I don't think it was by accident that at the recent RIMPAC exercises in Hawaii, I was actually in Hawaii at the time, South Korea sent the largest contingent by far of all participants in RIMPAC exercises. And of course, they also participated in Pacific Dragon, the trilateral missile defense tracking exercises. So, on paper, they may finesse it a little bit, but I think in substance, especially under the current government in Seoul, they will be very vigorous participants in all of these exercises that are designed to deter the sort of norm-violating behavior by other countries in the region.
Well, as you know that South Korean foreign policy, has been said, has been confined to peninsula issues or its vicinities, not really move beyond peninsular. So even though they do have, the successive governments, had regional policies, it is just on paper they didn't really, exercise it. So, this time the new government came in, as you say, that the government is very active, even militarily, and then draft a new Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific is by far the largest regional space South Korea ever conceived. Then do you really expect, given the track record, that South Korea really move, toward the Indo-Pacific?
I think there certainly is the potential. Well, I think you're right. Korea has always been focused on the peninsula, but it's also been a global player. Right? It sort of played a role on the global stage, whether it was the G20, climate change, a variety of different things. But it's been very much confined in terms of regional presence. And I think that's for two reasons. One is the very difficult relationship with Japan. And then the other, particularly after 2017, the THAAD sanctions, has been the fear of economic coercion from China. These two things, I think, have made it difficult for South Korea to play a larger regional role. But I think the answer to that is fairly simple, frankly, and people may not agree with me, but I think it's fairly simple, which is that the answer to that, to both of these questions, is supply chain resiliency, economic security. Because if South Korea can solve its economic security problem, it in many ways solves its China problem. And one of the ways to solve that economic security problem is Japan. Japan and the United States, particularly in terms of trilateral cooperation on critical minerals, on climate change, on EV batteries, on memory chips. There's an area ripe for cooperation among the three countries. So I think that, and a lot of these issues have become priority issues because of, in the post-COVID era, because of how everybody now acknowledges that there's a lot of supply chain vulnerability with regard to China. So I think in many ways, these two traditional issues that have made it difficult to Korea to participate regionally are now at a point where there's a single answer to that, which is economic security, supply chain resiliency. It's an incentive for cooperation with Japan, and it also will help Korea to solve its China problem.
And then so that's in the context of trilateral. Mostly trilateral.
I think that's in the context of trilateral, but it can also be larger. South Korea and Japan, for example, recently joined the U.S. Critical Minerals Partnership, securing critical minerals around the world. So I think it can be trilaterally, but can also be in the context of broader multilateral organizations. IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is another. We at CSIS are working on an idea called collective resilience, which is about countries that have been targets of Chinese economic coercion, mapping out their trade flows with China to get an understanding of what things they export to China that China is dependent on. Right. And so, I think there are a bunch of different multilateral groupings that Korea and Japan would not just be a part of, but would be very important players in to address some of these economic security problems, which for Korea will go a long way to addressing some of their problems with regard to connecting to the regional network. When Korea and Japan were estranged for 5 years in terms of their relationship, that was also the time during which Korea was very disconnected from the regional groupings that were growing in Asia, whether it was the free and open Indo-Pacific, the quadrilateral security dialogue, U.S., Japan, Australia development assistance dialogue. Korea was disconnected from a lot of that. CPTPP. They were disconnected from a lot of these things in part because of their very bad relationship with Japan, when Japan is a central player in a lot of these networks. Now, I would also say that the improvement in Japan-Korea relations is not just the responsibility of Korea. It's something that Japan also must do more, must work harder on. I think the Yoon government is working hard on this, and the Kishida government needs to do the same. But I think that this is really an opportunity for Korea to have a much firmer footing on how it manages China, while at the same time shoring up its alliance relationship with the United States and the trilateral relationship with Japan.
Well, do you see some positive role of the the Biden administration in improving the bilateral relationship, particularly this year? I mean, in the Indo-Pacific Strategy report, improvement of bilateral relationship is clearly stated. That's you never, seen it before.
Yes.
So, with that, do you see some proactive or positive role of the United States?
Yes, I think the U.S. role it's necessary. It may not be a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition for improvement in bilateral relations. I think that one of the reasons the relationship got so bad over the past 5 years is the previous administration in the United States had absolutely no interest in the spiraling of Japan-Korea relations. And by the time that then National Security Advisor John Bolton finally decided to make a trip out to Korea to deal with the downturn in relations after Japan removed Korea from the whitelist, and then Korea threatened to end the trilateral intelligence sharing agreement, GSOMIA. By the time Bolton came out for that, it was already too late. The relationship had gotten so bad. So we know from the Trump years what happens when the United States is not involved. There's no floor to the relationship between Japan. It can just go further and further into the basement, even subterranean below the basement. But I think right now the U.S. administration is very focused on this. We had early trilateral meetings. We had the early summit meeting in Madrid. At CSI, we've hosted Track 1.5 dialogues. The White House is basically willing to support anything on trilateral relations because they see it as important to their alliances with Japan and Korea, as important to supply chain and economic security, to managing China, to the free and open Indo-Pacific, to almost any issue. For the United States, this trilateral relationship is the foundation. So I think the Biden administration, is quite committed to this. But of course, it's necessary, but not sufficient. You need both Seoul and Tokyo to also want to move things forward.
Great. Maybe the last question to you. The Yoon government heralds the word global pivotal power. And I think that the government, use that term, but, needs to sort of, provide, contents, into that global pivotal state. I remember that 4 or 5 years ago, you drafted the Korea Pivot paper that I remember. And then, that paper discusses South Korea's global role. With that, would you want to suggest, what South Korea can do as a global player and also as a middle power?
So yes, thank you for remembering that, remembering that piece about Korea's pivot strategy. I think that Korea already plays a very important role as a middle power, and the real question is whether it can transition from middle power to global power. I think across the metrics it is a global power, sixth most capable military, 10th largest economy in the world. These are not minor league numbers. These are major league numbers. And I think the two big questions, I think, with regard to playing this larger global pivotal state role is how far Korea is willing to go on these global issues in a way that that can hurt their equities with China and Russia. That's one. And then the other is how far they're willing to go in terms of this global role in a way that takes attention away from Peninsula and North Korea issues. I think the first of these is a bigger challenge than the second, in the sense that I think, as we talked about, in authoring an Indo-Pacific strategy, how do they author one that is supportive of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, but that doesn't upset China? Or when it comes to supporting self-determination and the protection of democracy in Europe, how far are they willing to go to support Ukraine without hurting their relationship with Russia? These are the trade-offs when you talk about becoming a global power. Other countries face these trade-offs. The United States, Japan, excuse me, in the case of Japan, they basically undercut almost a decade of diplomacy with Russia on the northern territories in order to support the Ukraine after the Russian invasion. So there are definitely trade-offs here, and that will be the big transition for Korea to becoming a global pivotal state, is how willing they are to accept those trade-offs. Being a global pivotal state often means accepting short-term costs in terms of self-interest to pursue longer-term gains in support of the liberal international order. That's a tough trade-off to make. It's a tough one to make. But I think there are countries out there that are making that trade-off. And I'm not just talking about Japan, because Japan and Korea are different, but other so-called middle powers like Australia are willing to accept that trade-off. Germany, even now, more and more is willing to accept that trade-off in the post-Merkel era. There are many middle powers that are not willing to accept that trade-off. Brazil is not willing to accept it. There are other countries. But I think these are the key decisions ahead for Korea. When you talk to policymakers in Korea, the default is not to do that, right? The default is to say, well, we don't want to do that because then Russia will get upset, or we don't want to do that because China will get upset. But those are calculations of short-term interest that in the end are not supporting the liberal international order. And so, these are the big decisions ahead in terms of this concept of global pivotal state.